G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talk Stuff. Ukraine war update for the 27th of September 2025. The war rages, and as this war rages, the war of words continues. And it's taken yet another dark path. Of course, Ukraine continues to put out propaganda. We do not know the full context of this photograph, but it is clearly there to manipulate the mind, because you're going to wonder, who was in this bus? It's yellow, must be a school bus. But was it? We don't know. And you can't impose your culture onto the photograph. You have to know for a fact before you make judgment. Unfortunately, the media decides what you know. They don't say this bus was attacked at this time, at this location. You don't know if it was a bus running ammunition or reinforcements to the front. You just do not know. And for all you know, it was bombed by Ukrainian. I'm trying to think of the correct word. I suppose right now you'd call them dissidents. But what you see looks more like an internal explosion near the front. You see, it's blown the door from the inside, although it's blown that door off, that wheel off. But where's the wheel? Is this staged? You have to ask yourself. It was internal. Windows are blowing out. Everything's blowing away. But perhaps it was something that hit it from behind, bounced up and hit here and exploded. From the position of the sun, we don't have the time of day, but the way it's facing, it looks like the truck was clearly hit where it was hit where it was standing by an explosive. Before you know, Ukraine dragged out an old bus and hit it with an RPG from behind. Unless there is clear context, you cannot believe photographs. Yes, they tell a story, but that story has to link to memories. And when you have nothing to link it to, you'll attach your own culture. And that is the manipulation of the media. And how manipulation works is leaving deliberate gaps that you will fill with your own culture, not the facts on the ground. Because they never give you the facts on the ground. They give you propaganda time and time again. That Russia only attacks civilians. That Russia only kills women and children. That Ukraine always successfully destroys Russian oil refineries. And that Zelensky's the hero. He's fighting for the freedom of Ukraine. While being an unelected dictator of Ukraine. And that Zelensky makes threats on Putin's life and that of the top officials in Russia. He wants to bomb Moscow. And yet he complains at the same time about bombing Russia attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine. The man's a hypocrite. He's daring Russia to destroy Ukraine so he can cry victim. Because there are so many people around the world who are complete and utter assholes when it comes to victimhood. They need victims so they have something to feel sorry for, so they have some poor little pet to stroke, something to pity, so that they can engage in pity parties and emotion, because they're addicted to emotions. They're like junkies needing their next fix. And they become more and more outraged when they don't get their fixation of war and pestilence and disease, because they need to go out and fundraise for the poor oppressed brown people. Only Ukraine ain't brown people, man. Ukrainians, of course. Oh, no. Ukrainians have brought this on themselves. You can't pity the fool. You cannot save those who have no morals or salvation in their heart. You have to let them fall and fail. Did Jesus pick up the sinner and take him to the bath? No matter how much he complained, Jesus said, get up and do it yourself. You can do it. But Ukraine doesn't. They want to strike deep inside Russia. Of course, they'll complain when the Russian missiles fly. This is Zelensky, look at him. He is happy to destroy. He is happy to commit murder. But no, you'll see these glorious protests. Where are the anti-war protests? Where there are anti-war protests, you're just not allowed to see them because it's against the narrative of the World Economic Forum that their appointed son, Zelensky, shall rule over Ukraine in perpetuity. You have the Labour Party in Britain claiming they're going to be in power for at least the next 22 years. How can they make such bold statements and predictions if they aren't out there rigging the system in their favour? And Zelensky's talking about violations of airspace by reconnaissance drones from Hungary. Yeah, because you're lying about the war. You're lying about airspace violations. And you're lying about these are most likely, and of course we have a war of words. That Zelensky's losing his mind. He's blaming. Look, remember, Ukraine has created false flags before. They shot missiles into Poland and claimed they were Russian. The serial numbers on the missile casings were eventually traced to a Ukrainian arms factory from the Soviet era. And they even tried to blame air defense missiles. There was an accident. Air defense missiles did cross over into Poland. But then Zelensky claimed they were Russian missiles, even though earlier statements said that air defense missiles. Of course, we have Europe once again proving what everybody knows. They're fascist. They're banning political parties because they don't. And of course, Serbia is under European thumb. They're not allowed to think for themselves. Belarus has, of course, come under fire from Europe because they plan to help build a energy plant to supply energy and help supply energy to the Russian regions. Should stop calling them occupied because they're now Russian regions. They were Russian regions. That's the thing. Russia's just taking the territory back that was illegally given to Ukraine under the Soviet Union, and that the people there decided they weren't part of Ukraine, that they were being oppressed by Ukraine. And this all could have been avoided if Barack Obama was a statesman instead of a politically motivated wanker. And decided that he and not Ukraine decides the leadership of Ukraine. While Americans whine constantly about Russian interference, you have over 70 documented cases of American interference in elections and coups around the world. And somebody's going to one day say, don't be naive, everybody does it. So everybody's jumping off a cliff. You're going to jump off a cliff too and destroy yourself. Unfortunately, that's what feminism is. That's what liberalism is. That's what the whole left. It's all about destruction, self-destruction. They don't know the difference between humility and humiliation. They think you have to be humiliated to be humble. They're delusional, of course. They can't tell the difference between the words. Now, Russia has struck parts of Ukraine. Again, no context, often no videos. Because they don't want the truth. They can't handle the truth. Ukraine is not an open and fair and free democracy. Now, Russia's made advances in the northern buffer zone in Sumy. There is fighting in the northern buffer zone. There's fighting north of Kupiansk, and the Russians are fighting in the center of Kupiansk, though Kupiansk is just a small section of this greater area, although the actual name is Kupiansk Vozlovy. Kupiansk is just one of many suburbs. See, once upon a time, Ukraine was all these small petty towns. It wasn't a country. And over time, particularly under Soviet and later in the Soviet era, these towns were all centralized with centralized administration. But these small villages, now Russia's advanced north of Lyman, again, only taking a small town, but they've made a breakthrough in Zakrin. They've broken through the Ukrainian line, but not by far. They're still fighting in, I suppose you call it the center of Zakrin. It's not that big, or the outskirts of Zakrin, sorry. Zakrin's not that big. But again, they control most of the area between Zakrin and Torsk. Of course, there's the forest and open areas. They've made, where was it? A small advance here, but it's to, north of Sevesk. But I don't think they've taken the entire town. No, they might have. But they're still fighting in areas north of Chavashia, which Russia's claimed another town here. Now, this is important, and I'll get back to it later. How many towns they've captured? Well, it varies. And, well, again, I'll get back to the number of towns later. I'll continue with the battlefield update now. Of course, Russia struck the second Zelensky line in multiple places. They are striking cost from multiple directions. I think a lot of people have the video game mentality when it comes to combat or the shooting range. You know, when they go to a shooting range and in short range they feel something full of lead. In battle, you ain't fighting at short range. Militaries do not rarely engage at short range because it usually ends in a mutual massacre, okay? Bullets fly both sides, chew each other to pieces. They usually fight unless it's an ambush, they fight at long range. And of course, I forget the exact odds, but it's really huge, right? You fire shells all day in a city, and you can tear up, you do hardly any damage. You could lay siege to a city for months and do little damage. Depends how much artillery you bring to bear, how much guided ordnance you bring to bear. And from some of the artillery footage of the early days of the war, you know, someone said Ukraine expends about 7,000 and Russia expends about 10,000, which works out to be about one shell every 100 meters or something, and that's it. If you've got most guns are firing between 5 and 10 shells, or some less per day. So they ain't it ain't very intense. You compare. If it was a single battle over a single town, 10,000 shells raining on Konsk in a day, yeah, that would be devastating. Now, of course, Russia continues to its push. They haven't broken the Ukrainian lines, but the Ukrainian lines are getting hammered and have not been able to push the Russians back. And the fighting is, though favouring the defenders, the Ukrainians have been worn down. And while the Ukrainians have been contained in other areas, Russia's advancing. It may not be much, but Russia's advancing every day, little by little, wearing the Ukrainians down. Meanwhile, Ukraine lashes out. Now, the reason why I said earlier that how many towns have been liberated by Russia is that the Russians have only liberated 4 towns. See, these 4 towns marked on the map are actually over the last week. And even Russia admits that. So Ukraine has finally admitted that it's lost those towns. It just hasn't updated the map fully. But it's if we go by the Russian maps, there isn't much difference. The Russian maps just show Russia slightly ahead of where their current positions are. It doesn't have... and yet, some areas Russia has advanced further and has been pushed back, or... this is often by the Russians realizing that you can't go past the air defense perimeter. Okay, the drones and missiles, right? If you go, are guaranteed to hit you if you're outside the air defense perimeter. At least if you stay inside the air defense perimeter, you have a fairly high chance of survival. most drones and missiles are shot down. Now, Russian forces have, of course, inflicted a lot of casualties over the last 24 hours. And in one area, over 2,000 Ukrainians. In the last week, 3,600 in another area. Thousands. Now, Ukraine is operating drone boats in the Black Sea, which is putting neutral shipping at risk. Or are they using British submarines? Because Ukraine has no submarines, allegedly. Although this may turn out to be who's harbouring them. Are they using neutral shipping, which is a violation of the rules of war? It's a war crime. Because Zelensky wants now Tomahawk missiles, according to British Daily. We do know that Ukraine did ask for long-range missiles, but I thought that implied ATACMS and not Tomahawks. Though the Telegraph has often been correct, so you can't dismiss this as Russian propaganda. Tomahawks are well beyond the range of the Special Military Operations Zone, and of course $2 million a pop, for one rocket. Gives you an idea the difference in expenditure. Of course, why would Ukraine need Tomahawk missiles if they're developing their own Neptune? Like I said, Ukraine is not developing its own Neptune rocket. Ukraine is strapping wings and a rocket booster to British, and they're running out of British missiles to recase. So they're going to recase Tomahawks as Neptune missiles. And claim, because Zelensky has decided that should the military fail, when the Ukrainian military fails, that only then will he resort to diplomacy. But of course, he's telling Axios that we will never recognize these territories. They're temporary. They're only occupied. But then he claims to be a good leader, claiming that there would be a good compromise. And what's that compromise? We get everything we want by diplomatic means, if not the weapon. It's a good compromise for everybody. There'll be less losses. Wait a minute. If you recognize the territories now, that too will reduce the loss of life. So you're a hypocrite. You're saying that Russia has to give up to save lives, yet you can't give up because you want to save lives. That's not how that works. You don't tell the winner of the war, yeah, you can go home now, pack up your toys and go home. Well, that's what Zelensky is. He's that spoiled brat who has everyone round for a birthday party, crosses his arms when he loses pin the tail on the donkey, and then screams everybody has to go home because he lost. And of course you can't take of course you don't get the toy. It's my birthday. It's my toy. And if anybody's run a children's party, you should know, never put up a prize for pin the tail on the donkey, because unless you're rigging the game for the birthday boy, you're in big trouble. Or girl. Stupidity ain't sexist. And Zelensky, it's got nothing to... It comes from the fact he has a immoral background. He doesn't understand morality. So he doesn't understand that he is not a good leader. You don't declare yourself a good leader. But of course, Russia has a long history of destabilization. But if we go, the Russian Revolution, was destabilization by German socialists. Although they call themselves Marxist, but it's just socialism with another layer of bullshit. But these days, the centre of socialism for the world is Britain. And Britain has a long history of trying to destabilise Russia. Why? Because around the world leaders have decided that the only way they can get ahead is by ruining others. They can't compete fairly, so they resort to lying, cheating, stealing, and, of course, sabotage. Now, don't be naive that Russia is an innocent babe in the woods, but you can't complain about Russian interference when Russia isn't the mastermind of many ills in the world. I'm not saying that Britain alone is the mastermind of many ills in the world either. But you cannot take on the ills of the world if you're engaged in the ills of the world. You cannot fund coups around the world and then claim to be the kings of morality. There was The Life of Riley. Sidney Riley was an infamous spy. Everybody knew he was a spy, and yet in the 1920s, he decided he was the king of adventurism, and for a lark, he went to Russia. Of course, despite everybody knowing, he was blowing. He actually, Riley is notorious for his seducing of women in the Middle East and destabilizing Iran. He was actually, the Iranians identified him as a British agent, and he was blowing. And yet, despite that, he still continued to work and went to Russia. And it wasn't long before the Russians tracked him down. After hearing that Riley wasn't at his country home, they felt, I don't know if this is intuition or what you would call it, but they suspected that he was back in business. And that Soviet security officers, hearing about subversive groups, started hearing whispers of Riley being active in the USSR, and turns out those whispers were right. But of course, it wasn't intuition. The Soviets had penetrated British intelligence. Many of those traitors who survived through the Cold War did not 1 ounce of regret. They enjoyed their life as a double agent. They believed they were saving the world from capitalism. Unfortunately, now we're saving the world from Christian nationalists. And the same delusion that drove socialism is now gone from Russia to Britain. And why does the UK keep spreading anti-Russian propaganda? Because Britain has little man syndrome. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever see the circumstances again where anybody will put together such a large empire, but never say never. But Britain didn't exactly conquer the world. They got the world to hand itself over through pretty much the same means Alexander and many others before it. Recruit thy enemies to become recruit thy enemy's enemy. And that's how these subversions go, and we're never going to, completely stop this. But unless Britain, America, and all the other world powers stop playing the Machiavellian game, but as Machiavelli, I don't know if Machiavelli said it himself. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Machiavelli invented the game of power. I think what he did was he had a hold of the Roman Book of Power, and that Cicero didn't invent the game of power. He only recognized the game of power. And the game of power is not confronting your enemies, but undermining them, of which you basically get the modern term, the useful idiot. All the lefties out there, they are nothing more than useful idiots of people who spread propaganda. They're the victims of propaganda. They're the ones who believe Russian collusion. They're the ones who believe that Russia's destabilizing the world, or that white Christian nationalists are a problem. Well, if white Christian nationalists are such a problem, flee to Venezuela or go to Saudi Arabia. You want Sharia law? Go to Saudi Arabia. What Saudi Arabia won't tell you is that they were once a Christian country, conquered. Yeah. Everything you have done shall come to pass. Everything shall come to pass. All the works of man shall come to pass. All these games shall come to pass. The fight against evil is never ending. And right now, we have seen the tide turn against the left. And the reason why the British hate Russia is that the Russians are no longer a useful enemy that weak governments can use to blame their economic woes on. And Trump should distance himself further from Ukraine, but of course, he's in the great trap of alliances, which I think Jefferson warned about. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Jefferson warned about foreign entanglements. But he wasn't the only one. Throughout history, there's people who warned about alliances. Goes all the way back to Rome. Beware of, there's nothing worse than a Roman diplomat. How do you know your country is fucked? A Roman diplomat on his way, Actually, if you look at the history of Eastern Europe, they had Germanica and all that. You actually go back through history and you actually see Rome didn't have it so easy. I mean, the Mongols, they had a bigger empire, but of course, they eventually butted up to I think Persia, and eventually, I'm not sure. I think the Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, had already collapsed before but it was the Mongols and somewhat the Mongols and Persians who took eventually the Constantinople. So there was never really a truly historical time of a clash of empires. Each can rise and fall on their own to some extent. But what we see time and time again is man's inhumanity, to create artificial empires. And right now we're in the age of artificial empires yet again, and Britain sucking up the power of... And we know that Britain is not Britain anymore. And the British people are waking up to that fact, that their government is against the British people, and their government wants to be part of this global UN, and this is what is really going on. Ukraine is a clash between the loose federation of states, of independent states, versus the globalist hegemony. And we, in the West, shouldn't be fighting with... we shouldn't have a clash of empires. What we should be doing is letting independent states be independent states within the loose federation. Get rid of the EU. Get rid of the UN. Every superstate wants to become a bigger superstate. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to support the channel. You can support me through Patreon, buy my books, buy my merch. All my links are in the link tree description below, in my profile, or scan the QR code on the screen. Please and thank you. See you in the next video, and bye for now.